John, so to join it off.
And that covers up to
Oh yes.
yeah, okay, that's right.
It's basically a biography of the stuff.
Yeah,
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back, and I hope that your lunch went well. And without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Tony for our third session. Welcome also to those who are with us at home.
Yes, I'm very aware of the people who are, you know, because if it gets boring, you can wander off and make a cup of tea, you know. or just wander off. But I hope those people are still there too. One or two people I know. I should say, well, two things. I don't know if any of the copies of the book are left at the back. Too brave to dream, but if there are any there, please buy them so I don't have to take them back home with me. And secondly, just to say how much I've enjoyed this. I've had so many good questions. So I'm going to go away with a whole number of things I've got to follow up and think about. And it's been delightful to meet a few people that I've met before at R S Thomas events or have been in touch with me. So thank you for coming. Right. Now then, I want in this last session to look at a range of poems from very late in R S Thomas's career. Several of them are unpublished. We only have them in manuscripts. We have quite a... He continued, I mean, his last book, No Truce with the Furies, what a great title, 1995, but he lived for another 5 years and he continued to write. And so we have quite a lot of unpublished manuscripts in various stages. Some of them seem to be complete, others are certainly drafts, and at some point we've negotiated now with Wynne Thomas in Swansea, who's the literary executor, Jason and I are going to carry this forward. Well, probably Bludex will be interested, as you know, reviews of the uncollected poems which Jason and I did a few years ago for the centenary. People say, well, who knew there was still more R S Thomas, you know? So let's see. But these are manuscripts, and again, I'm quite neurotic about these manuscripts because, you know, they are very much copyright. So please don't send them on and sell them, put them on the internet or anything, because, you know, I'm in trouble. Just, you know, I'm sure there's people here just enjoy them. Yeah, what I should... Oh, one thing I should say, I mentioned the Bangor Cathedral's use of that awful picture. Somebody asked me about it afterwards. The event is on Good Friday at 6. It will be online. It's musical settings, it's 7 movements of poems and poems by Welsh writers, but also by RS, some of which are other and collector, unpublished poems. So if anybody's interested, go online to the Bangor Cathedral. It's called There Was a Garden. There Was a Garden. Right, I've mentioned Elsie Eldridge on a couple of occasions. I'm working on her diaries and journals at the moment. Here she is in the 30s. Get this line up for the camera as well. This was taken in the early 30s. I mean, you know, Greta Garbo. I mean, you know, this is, you know. She was an art student. Went to the Royal College of Art, exhibited, became a professional artist, did a lot of illustrating, and was an artist for the 50 years of their marriage. Art, visual arts were part of the relationship, and I mean, hence, in some ways, hence the collection. He knew about art. He met Mildred Elsie Eldridge. She's very English. Father was a jeweller. Known as Elsie, the Welsh spelling E-L-S-I, when he was a young curate at Chirk in the 1930s. Just think for a moment, R.S. had been brought up in Holyhead. He'd come all the way, half an hour, to Bangor, to university. All right, he'd had a year at Theological College, and then he comes back to North Wales. This is not an extensive life experience. Elsie had been to art school. She'd been to Italy and studied in Italy. She spoke French. She'd spent time in France. And I mean, she must have knocked his socks off. Evelyn Davis told me that the vicar at Chirk had told her that he thought the vicar when RS was there, he was besotted with her. No, it's not great. Yeah. She was lodging with a fellow teacher at a substantial house in the centre of Chirk. She painted a mural, and the mural is still on the wall. It's deteriorating. And RS, there were a number of spare rooms, and RS, as the curate, moved into one of these. And he was along. They went off camping together in mid-Wales before they were married. And nobody seems to have commented on this. And, it's very interesting. She had a car, he didn't. And he went into the house, and he says in his autobiography, when he talks about marriage, she was living nearby. Anyway, graduate of the Royal College of Art, studied in Italy. She'd exhibited in London. She had her own exhibition at the Beaux-Arts Gallery in London. She became an art teacher in Oswald Street, which is how she was nearby. But two different worlds. They were married in 1940. R S Thomas wrote poems to her throughout their life together. They were married, as I say, for 50 years. Although until fairly recently, these didn't receive much attention from critics. On her death, he wrote a remarkable series of elegies to her. She died in 91. I think genuinely some of them are comparable with Thomas Hardy's elegies to his wife, those marvellous poems of 12, 13. And for somebody who, it's that baleful figure I keep coming back to, peering out of that half door, and who says the Daily Telegraph, I'm not a very loving man, it's there in the poetry. Whatever he couldn't say over the dining table, he says in the poetry. There is if you're interested in this aspect of his work, Damien Walford Davis has published Poems to Elsie. This is Seren Press, it's in print. And there are a couple of previously unpublished poems in there. But I want to look at some of these manuscript poems, certainly because they're new and interesting, and tell us something about his thinking. But I want to start with this poem to Elsie. It was originally written in 1989 to mark Elsie's 80th birthday. And the manuscript of this you've got is on the front of the sheet. We only acquired this, we had later versions, but we suspected there was an earlier one. We only acquired this amongst a remarkable private collection of R S poems, which we bought for the centre 3 or 4 years ago. It was immediately before COVID. We had to do all the negotiation and the fundraising during lockdown. It was interesting. 80th birthday. Let's have a look at this. This is the first version, 1989. My luminary, my morning and evening star, my light at noon when there is no sun and the sky laughs. My balance, there's that word again, my balance, and here he's talking about the gold standard, my balance of joy in a world that has gone off joy's standard. Yours the face I recognised when young, as though I had known you of old. Come, my eyes said, out into the morning of a world whose dew waits for your footprint. Disdaining a ministrant, I looked God in the eye and took those unfrocked vows that neither the church could void nor the machine cheapen, that with the years have grown to an unseen bond, harder than iron, light as platinum on my ringless finger. Again, some powerful lines there, surely. Disdaining a ministrant, I look God in the eye. I rather like that. Now this version, presumably he gave it to Elsie, no evidence of that, you assume he did. He then types up, it's on the next sheet, as homage or homage. And there it is. You assume that he would then await his next collection and duly become part of his work. But in fact, at some point, presumably in the early 90s, he evidently returns to the poem. And that, I've given the manuscript version of that too. So I must make sure I've got the right version. If I say it's here and it's not, can you gesticulate? Because I'm not. Yeah, I have got the right one. This is. Yeah, I put 2 versions together. Okay, so this is obviously another manuscript. We had this manuscript in the collection. He's returned to the poem. The first part is the said. Come, halfway down, come my eyes said, out into the morning of a world whose dew waits for your footprint. But then we don't get disdaining a ministrant, I look God in the eye. We get, before a green altar, with a thrush for priest, I took those gossamer vows that neither the church could stale, nor the machine tarnish, that with the years have grown hard as flint, lighter than platinum, on our ringless fingers, not my ringless finger. So now there's no disdaining ministrant and so forth. Instead, we have a more pastoral scene, one which seems to me to owe something to the medieval Welsh poet Dafydd ap Gwilym, who occasionally views the Welsh landscape in such sacramental terms, and indeed for whom birds often play a special role. This manuscript version, again, he didn't publish the revised version. In the event, R.S. and Elsie's son, Gwydion, in a little collection of just 15 copies. If you see a copy, buy it. It's called Ringless Fingers. It's published in 2002 in Thailand. Not an easy find, but we then collected it in the book Uncollected Poems, which are, I've got here, yes. Sorry, this is not advertising. What we did to the centenary was to round up poems which both Jason and I initially independently had been finding in magazines and journals, but were not collected into the books. And later on, he published a lot of poems in for charity. In Save the Children, Oxfam. They'd write to him, and then he got a poem because people would buy the booklet or whatever. And I think he just used to forget about them. He was still quite prolific. But anyway, Luminary is in there. I think I'm going to go off script here just for a moment, given what people have been saying to me over lunch, and read one more poem to Elsie. It's called Comparisons. Now, I'm reading this partly again to underline R S Thomas' love poet, but the delicacy of which R.S. was capable. I mean, a lot of people still know him as the poet of Iago Pryfach, well, that one of those sweaty, muscular countrymen. Listen to this. Comparisons. To Elsie, it's one of the elegies. To all light things I compared her, to a snowflake, a feather. I remember she rested at the dance on my arm as a bird on its nest, lest the eggs break, lest she lean too heavily on our love. Snow melts, feathers are blown away. I have let her ashes down in me like an anchor. And again there's the pun in that last three-line stanza. I have let her ashes down in me like an anchor. It ends up with that firm note, her love, our love, But there's also that suggestion that you can't miss. I have let her down. Regret is still there. Anyway, it's a fine, delicate poem. As I say, when he died in 2000 at the age of 87, R.S. had not published a collection of poems for 5 years, one of them titled No Truce with the Furies. But he certainly hadn't stopped writing, and we hope to get some of these into print at some point. A range of themes and recurring motifs. One of these motifs is the seeking for what he calls in a couple of manuscripts the great poem, the successful poem, the great poem. The seeking for the completion of the great poem is at times an image of the seeking for, in his phrase, the actual being of God. It's as though the capacity to write the successful poem, the great poem, is a sign of spiritual awareness, of grace, if you will. And one's reminded of George Herbert, for example, and on more than one occasion, the actual completion of the poem, it's almost as if the completion of the poem is God's. God intervenes, because Herbert moves into a state of grace. As when the heart says, sighing to be approved, oh, could I love, and stops, God writes, loved. You know, it's that kind of, I think that's what RS is working at. This mode of thinking recurs in an untitled typescript, which one feels speaks with a poignant directness out of the elderly poet's own experience. This is the typescript is on the sheets, old age for some. It's not titled. Old age for some is weakness, is stiffness, is the fear that death will come with all its flags flying, beating on pain's drum, grinning into his face, stealing his last ration of scant breath, burying its claw in his entrails. For me, old age, is awaiting, as always, for wishes keeping their distance, for the great poem, for the one truth, for the God who has not spoken. Come, Lord, I say, and the poem brushes me, but it brushes by. Is this truth, I ask, finding the heart empty of the love I expected to constrain? It is prayer's joints I discover to be stiff. It is charity that I fast from. I've laboured all my days in the burden and heat of a syntax, and now, at the last hour, I am no nearer my reward than these later comers who have agreed for the same promise to be taken in. There's the pun again. As I say, Damien has pointed out how often this occurs. Taken in to God's comforting presence, or taken in, as we colloquially use it, to be gullibly deceived. Once more, the poet waits rather than hurrying on, but the poem that he's trying to write only brushes him. He doesn't quite achieve the longed-for great poem, or a secure sense of God's presence. This is the point. There is, it seems, too much doubt, too much anxiety, too much thinking, maybe, which serves in turn as a constraint on his own capacity to feel love and express charity. So that the failure of the creative imagination, the failure to write the poem, is an indicator of that emotional incapacity. You know? It's the sort of thing you get in the Ancient Mariner, I think, for Coleridge. The Ancient Mariner, remember, is alone, alone, and all alone. And he kind of looks with disgust, really, disdain at the sea creatures. But then he sees them again. He sees them as happy living things. He sees them with what he calls the creative imagination. And then a spring of love gushes from his heart, and he finds that Mariner finds the self-same moment I could pray. It's a moment, Coleridge is writing here about the creativity of the imagination, of a loving response to the world. And I think, when he feels that love, then, he's at one with the natural universe. And these are the kinds of tension I think are here in RS 2. The failure of the creative imagination as an indicator of incapacity. Perhaps we could say that the anxiety constrains or suppresses the capacity to be still and wait. So that exists only in TypeScript. The reports kept coming, although there is no title. There is a manuscript of this, which you've got. A number of the uncollected poems, as I said, that we published in the book, had appeared in books or pamphlet for charities, Shelter, I can remember, Oxfam, Anti-Apartheid Movement. In other words, there is a social conscience in some of these poems. which perhaps one doesn't always associate with RS. He's so bound up with his own beliefs, his own things, vision, that the kind of social activity of the poet we don't associate with it, but it is there in the later work, interestingly. This responsiveness to human suffering in the actual world around him is present in this one. It's a poem, as I say, it's never been typed up until now. It is shot through, I think, again, with a nightmarish quality, a sense of unreality, which colours a number of these late poems. You've got the manuscript, but I've typed it up on the next page. The reports kept coming and coming. I gave up the newspapers, let all my batteries run down, my licenses expire. I shared my meals with a house mouse, watched it filling itself full on a few crumbs. What genie had got into the room at the rubbing of my cold hands? As I looked at it, it turned into a small child, into hundreds of grey children watching me with eyes like blackberry seeds to discover what I would do next with all the pieces of small change going mildew in my pocket. I'm not sure I'd recognise that as an R S Thomas poem when I read it. The scene is presumably that old cottage at Sarna Place near Aberdaron, which was in winter notoriously cold and damp. Gwydion talks about the mould, and in which mice were a regular and not unwelcome visitor. I on my wall a beautiful watercolour of a house mouse, which Elsie painted in the house. So but here we slide from the domestic into another realm. We notice that reference to the genie. He rubs his hands and it's like rubbing the magic lamp, isn't it? The genie. The mouse transmutes into a child and then into grey children. The phrase itself is interesting, grey children, and one wonders if at some level, however half-conscious, Thomas was recalling the title of a book by his friend, the distinguished novelist James Hanley. Hanley had lived nearby at Llanfechai, when the Thomases were at Manaveron in the 40s and early 50s. It was Hanley, in fact, who sent Thomas's poetry to Robert Hart Davis and who published them as Song of the Year's Turner in 1954. So they were close, and Hanley really would belong to be grateful to. In the 1930s, Hanley wrote a powerful book documenting the awful social conditions of working class families in the South Wales valleys. He called it Grey Children, with the subtitle A Study in Humbug and Misery. It was part of that movement of social observation in the 1930s. Road to Wigan Pier, it's another one. Grey Children. So it's impossible to know how conscious Thomas was of the echo, but he was clearly conscious of how across the world, a world governed by the machine, children are still in misery. There in the poem. Possibly not coincidentally, the next poem in the file of manuscripts that we have is a poem he contributed. I don't think I put this. Did I put this on? No, I didn't put this on the sheet. I'll just read it. The next poem is one he contributed to an anthology published to raise funds for Shelter, the charity for the homeless, and it was entitled Born Lost. Notice the title, because I will come back to this. It is a thicket, the branches are bone, faces stare out at us, human faces with mouths wrenched on a wild cry. I am hungry, I am alone, to be born lost. What greater misery can befall? Now, one of the recurring themes I'm trying this out, new material, see what you make of it. One of the recurring themes in R S Thomas's later poetry in the 80s and 90s is, and it's very relevant to what we've been saying earlier on, a sense of loneliness, and relatedly a sense of being lost or disorientated. It's obviously there in the contemporary poems. It's not just a social loneliness, but an existential loneliness. In 1981, for instance, Thomas publishes The New Noah. It's, again, not collected until recently. It was in a booklet put together by a small community arts group in Leamington. Now, for whatever reason, they never included it, and it was never published. In many ways, the Noah here sounds less like the Noah we find in Genesis and more like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner and his profound sense of isolation. Remember the mariner, alone, all alone on a wide sea. Here's R S Thomas's New Noah. This is not on the sheet. Day by day, loneliness, emptiness, with nothing but the whales rolling. A bird came winging over the waste waters, settled on the aft hatch. He put out a dry hand, but the bird clawed him. Now Noah's desolation in a seemingly hostile world seems here to be deeply imagined, felt by the poet. It's nothing to do with the biblical Noah, and this is more to do with the Ancient Mariner. It's a state of mind, even of spirit, with which I think suggested R.S. was familiar. And then in 1995, the poem I just looked at, Born Lost. It is a thicket, the branches are bone, faces stare out at us, human faces with mouths wrenched on a wild cry. I am hungry, I am alone, to be born lost, what greater misery can befall? Now there is in the Bangor archive a manuscript of this poem. And the only revision in the manuscript occurs at I am hungry, I am alone, as originally was I am lonely, I am lonely. The change perhaps focuses the condition of the homeless, their hunger, the lack of food, that retains a sense of isolation. As I said, this acute sense of isolation seems to be a recurring motif in the later work, to have no sense of home again. In No Truce with the Furies, published in the same year, 1995, we have a poem called The Lost. She does publish this one. We are the lost people. Show us, we supplicate, the way home. There's the word again. And they, laughing, hiss at us. But you are home. Come in and enjoy it. Will nobody explain what it is like to be born lost? He uses the same phrase as in the shelter poem. At one level, this one's a poem about Wales. We have our signposts, but they are in another tongue. But clearly this loneliness, this longing for a home, has more universal resonance than Wales, and more personal resonance too. But there is also a recurring thread which provides the longed-for alternative, the longed-for good place, the glimpses of a state of being in which the poet does not feel isolated and disorientated, where he might feel, however fleetingly, emotionally and spiritually, at home. In a poem called Avachan, for instance, in No Truce with the Furies, a quote, the traveller gets down onto a midnight platform and knows from the rustle of unseen waterfalls he has come home. Home, where we know who we are, a place where we are recognised, other people know who we are, and no longer alone. And we notice that this is a homecoming to a rural place. Avachan is, of course, in Welsh mythology, the timeless place, Avalon, usually filled with birdsong, the theme is most fully developed in his prose piece, and we will know it, Aber Ciarg, the visionary place that we never quite reach. It's from a medieval Welsh poem, and Aber Ciarg, it's Ganant Gogai, in Aber Ciarg, the cuckoos are singing. It's that lost home. All of which is by way of an introduction to the unpublished poem, which is on the sheet, the one that starts off, Troy was sacked. It's on page 9. Okay, so I just want to pick up these things now in the Vathlon image. Okay, this is, I've typed this up from the manuscript. I've not reproduced the manuscript for this one. What is interesting here is that he's crossed it out. In the manuscript, he's drawn a line down it. Did he abandon it? Did he come back to it? Did you rewrite it? If he did, we haven't got it. We don't know. All we've got is this manuscript with a line through it. Here typed up. Leaf has got a question mark in front of it simply because it's not absolutely clear in the manuscript. I'm pretty confident it's leaf, green leaf. And there's no full stop at the end, which seems appropriate somehow. Anyway, Troy. Troy was sacked. Carthage fell. Where did the peace of these Montgomeryshire byways come from? The poet saw, standing between the myrtles, Christ risen. I see, in the hawthorn blossom, his cast-off burial garments, and hear blackbird music blown in the face of the June sun. If you would partake of the life he won for us, discard your motor, turn over a green leaf, enter among dwellings too few for a village, too negligible for a name. Follow in a direction whose terminus is nowhere. Wonderful paradox. You can't have a terminus which is nowhere if you see what I mean. Immediately, the transitoriness of empires is evoked. Troy, Carthage, unspokenly Britain, I don't know. The transience, anyway, of human military and political power. And in sharp contrast to the imperial, we have again, as in the Vathlon, the Welsh rural scene. Peaceful in every sense, and surely unassuming, unassertive. One notices these Montgomeryshire byways, which give the scene immediacy. He and we are there. And they are byways, little travelled and little known side roads, not busy and important main roads. That in itself is a little R S Thomas theme. Some of you will be aware of a poem called The Chapel, which of course is a little aside from the main road. But we're back in the Montgomeryshire countryside of Thomas's early Manavan years. And he recalls at line 4, the poet saw, standing between the myrtles, Christ risen. Who is the poet? Well, he's remembering Anne Griffiths, the great Welsh poet and hymn writer of the Methodist Revival. In one of her most famous hymns, she wrote a series of visionary hymns. She sees the figure of Christ waiting for her under the myrtles. Visionary moment. Well-learned, Serech, Rhwng y Myrtwydd. Now, interestingly, I think the speaker in Thomas's poem doesn't claim to actually see Christ as Anne did. He makes a distinction. The poet saw, I see. He's reminded of Christ's resurrection, the cast-off burial garments in the tomb, by the hawthorn blossom. Yeah? though we notice that there's no mystical moment as such, they remain blossoms. And then at line 9, there's the lovely synesthesia, where the senses are mixed, so you see music and I don't know, smell colours, that kind of synesthesia. There's the blackbird music blown in the face of the June sun. The sound of the birds is so intense as to seem physical and tactile. It's like that blackness in Evans. Only then does the poet address the reader directly. If you would partake of the life he won for us. Partake's a curious word, isn't it? Partake, sharing, become part of. Partake. There's almost a liturgical feeling to it, perhaps, in some way. And then on line 13, we're really into late RS. Discard your motor. Not just, I think, get out of your car, but more fundamentally and more radically than that, perhaps. Discard your car. Get rid of your car and the way of life that it represents. There's again an environmental dimension to this. Turn over a new leaf. Or as RS says, turn over a green leaf, with all the resonance that that adjective has. Natural, innocent, fresh. And enter this place, this community. A place, it seems, where one can, like Anne, be spiritually at home. And as the ending suggests, this is a place that's not an end in itself, not a terminus, but a place, a way of life, which gives access to another non-finite reality. And Griffiths, whose maiden name was Thomas, was one of R S Thomas's spiritual heroes. He comes back to her in a number of places. He writes an early poem called Anne Griffiths, and then he writes a longer poem which concludes his collection, Welsh Airs, Fugue for Anne Griffiths. Well worth reading. She lives, R.S. tells us, rather longingly, I always feel, this is in Fugue, a 19th century calm. That is, he says, a countryside not fenced in by cables and pylons, but open to thought to blow in, from as near as may be to the truth. It's the sort of place which R.S. evokes again in this unpublished poem, Troyal Sacked, and a place where one can transcend loneliness and isolation and partake of a transcendent reality which feels like home. I want to stay with this image of the rural calm for a moment. I'll just go back to the previous poem, which I skipped over. It was the sort of conversation. Again, it's amongst the unpublished manuscripts, that we do have a manuscript of this one. As I say, the quality of the manuscripts vary. Some of them are drafts, some of them are experiments. Others of them, like Troy, we're not sure. I think it's a good poem. I think many poets would be very happy to have written that poem, but he crosses it out. Some of them, in my view, if not great poems, are very fine indeed. Okay, it was the sort of conversation. It was the sort of conversation we were present at and listened to, but could make nothing of, yet we enjoyed it as who wouldn't. Trees with their leaves clasped as in a green prayer, birds singing fragrantly among the branches. There's the synesthesia again. Flowers with bird voices. It was like a reception in our honour we passed on a threshold of, unable or unwilling to believe we were invited. It became clear. The whole sky was a face tenderly inclined, thoughtful with cirrus. We could play like children in its sunlight, yet come to maturity under the quality of its concern. I looked at you in the dawn of an understanding that here was a presence that was neither human nor inhuman, but beyond both in its ability to gaze on as eyes closed. Again, the poem seems to me to achieve a remarkable tranquility, a natural concord enhanced by that synesthetic effect, actually quite unusual in Thomas. Birds singing fragrantly, flowers with bird voices. Harmony, a life-enhancing rural harmony. And notice the sense of someone else sharing it. I looked at you in the door. We don't know who that you is it Elsie? The poet is for once not isolated. A wonderful line break yet again. I looked at you in the door. A nice lyric moment. But then the enjambment gives us a whole new perspective. The door may be literal, but it is also metaphorical. I looked at you in the dawn of an understanding. Again, in further contrast to the loneliness we've been seeing in the poems, there is here a profound sense of a transcendent reality. That's what the poem's about. A presence. One that is caring and is reassuring, and in whose presence the human individual can achieve a childlike freedom and innocence. Again, more reminiscence of romantic tones. Time's going on. So to end, let us go to another unpublished manuscript, which still might be the title of poem of the unpublished collection that Jason and I will get into print one day, and the one at the end is called Pray. It brings together so many of R S Thomas's concerns and imagery, and indeed it echoes a poem called Raptor in his last volume, No Truce. That poem Raptor, which evokes the ambiguous nature of God's power, fastening his talons in his great adversary, or in some lesser denizen maybe, like you or me. God's love, whatever it is, has that ambiguity. Raptor. Pray is altogether more gentle, but again it centres on the elusive and paradoxical nature of God, the most compassionate of raptors. I think the poem is characteristically deft in its using, indeed revivifying, of familiar biblical images. The pearl of great price is here a pearl discovered in the soul shallows. Once more, the approach to the apprehension of God is not through active, articulated prayer, but in disciplining the tongue, and in a phrase we've almost heard already today, waiting upon silence. Almost inevitably, we return to the rejection of our contemporary world's anxious emphasis on speed and overtaking, the place where, he says, acceleration was the rule. But the short lines give a sense of the poet thinking, as it were, thinking aloud, thinking from line to line, the mind moving from idea to idea. The recurring present participles give the poem a sense of immediacy, present, albeit technically the poem is actually in the past tense. The whole poem has a firm quietness, culminating in a final assuredness, and I'll end with this poem. grateful always that not always nor often, but that at times he came. This in one known primarily for his absence was to a poor man riches beyond call, a pearl discovered in the soul's shallows, to sell everything to possess. This the reward for disciplining the tongue, for waiting upon silence, for pausing to ask why the heart loitered when acceleration was the rule. Thinking to lie in wait, I was laid in wait for, and praying, I was made the prey of, for all time, the most compassionate of raptors. Finally, God holds it. Thank you very much. Coming with his microphone.
Well, what a treat that was. Apart from anything else, Tony, you do read well. Don't you think he reads well? We're probably going to call it a day about 3 o'clock, so we've got a bit of time after to chat. Would anybody like to ask a question now? I brought the mic, but Alexandra, I didn't turn it on, so this is now number 2, and Tony will still be on number 1. Hello. Hello. We are on. Brilliant. Thank you, Christian.
Could I just ask about the poem title? Because
Sorry, I missed it
could
again.
I ask about the poem title?
Yeah.
Because I find it a very moving poem, written when he was at Amadaro.
Yes.
But I haven't seen much about it. It seems sort of slipped, I don't know, slipped under cover, so to speak.
Yeah.
Am I right?
I know the title, and I'm trying to. I'm just. Oh God, it's not in collect. Did you have the text?
It's not in the collective.
No. Oh, that speaks for itself. I'm sorry, I can't. Have you got some of the poem there? Oh, done. Okay. No, email me about it.
Is there a very special one?
Yes, I will kick myself when I see it, but I can't recall it to mind at this point. As I said, the sea is a presence. Although I wrote about this somewhere, but even Anne, you see, who lives in Wales, Anne Griffiths. I mean, it's a kind of relief rather than a statue in one of the churches. But he sees this as the prow of a ship. He sees her as this, again, I must kick a guardian hero, battling through the fathoms, and I think one of the reasons he latches on to that image in Kierkegaard at one level is this deep awareness of the sea. And I mean, I have no explanation as to why that should be. I mean, you can point to, as I have done, to the father as a sailor, himself a kind of Kierkegaardian hero at times. But I'm just fascinated that it's an imaginative resource all the way through. So, title I'll look it up, but do email me and I'll look. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Tony. Another question?
This is on similar lines, really. It's a bit cheeky, but I wondered if you would mind reading The Bright Field.
Now that is in here, isn't it? Yeah, we were talking about this in the lunch break. The Bright Field 302. I was about to say it's almost a visionary poem, and I think that is. I mean, what's going on here? It's called The Bright Field. I'm sure many of you will know it. It's been anthologized. It's in the Everyman collection. In some ways, it's a very Welsh poem. I was driving down yesterday and driving down along the coast, and it was absolutely thrown it down the rain, as it's done so much this year. But then, as happened the day before, I'm looking across, I can see Anglesey from my house, and I mean, Anglesey's been invisible for so much of the last month, 6 weeks more, and the sun was shining just on that end where Bonaris is, and as the light changes, and he was a great walker, of course, RS, and so he'd seen these things as he walked. So this is called Bright Field. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while. Again, he does it, a field for a while, and gone my way, and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had the treasure in it. I realise now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses, to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. Oh, reading that again picks up so many of the motifs we've touched on, that turning aside that we get in Troy, not the main road, but the side road, the lane, giving not the speed, and indeed almost not time itself here, not nostalgia nor ambition, but stepping aside even from process itself to be aware of some other timeless, sorry, I'm thinking out loud here, but that's what's going on, isn't it? And it becomes a meditation on that clue that the sun has given them. I'm so glad you asked that one, because it's pulled things together rather nicely, hasn't it? Yeah, thank you.
Now, I'm conscious that we've had several hands up, which is very exciting, which says a lot about the topic. We will certainly, I think, have time for two and maybe for more, but of course we can mingle afterwards as well.
Your very last reading of the poem Pray in your talk, it set me thinking, is there any evidence that, this may be wishful thinking, but I wondered if there was any evidence if he had actually had a mystical experience, or was it more a kind of willed acceptance?
It's a lovely question. It depends what you mean by mystical. If you take, somebody mentioned earlier on, if you're willing to gloss that as the timeless moment, there's a poem called The Thicket in Llyn. There is a prose version of this, which I think is actually rather better than the poem. Let me see, I can't recall off the top of my head whether, yes, it is here. If you can bear it, since it's not, I don't think this is a great poem, but it fits. Oh, it's too long to read. I'll just read part of it. What he sees are the birds. I was no tree walking. I was still. They ignored me. The birds in this bush, and the bush is almost alive. This thicket's almost alive with the birds. And for this moment, it's a moment out of time. Maybe not a mystical experience, and I'm probably theologically all over the place here, but it is like Eliot's timeless moment. They would have perched on me had I had nourishment in my fissures, as the tree does. As it was, they netted me in their shadows, brushed me with sound, feathering the arrows of their own bows, and were gone, leaving me to reflect on the answer to a question I had not asked. A repetition in time of the eternal I am, capitals as Coleridge. A repetition in time of the eternal I am. Say it. Don't be shy. Escape from your mortal cage and thought. Your migrations will never be over. Between two truths there is only the mind to fly with. Navigate by such stars as are not leaves falling from life's deciduous tree, but spray from the fountain of the imagination, endlessly replenishing itself out of its own waters. That doesn't work as well as an answer to your question as the prose piece does, Thicket and Clean, where he does experience a timeless moment. He's taken out of himself, and then all of a sudden he comes back and he meditates on it, and he quotes the Coleridge, that the repetition of the finite mind of the infinite I am, that is of God. This moment is such a repetition. That's the closest I can think that he comes. He says somewhere, because my colleague Tony Conran referred to him as a nature mystic in an essay. And R S, rather, in a subsequent interview, rather pulled back from that. He talked about his relationship with nature, but didn't want to talk about those as mystical moments. So that's the best I can do by way of an answer. I don't quite see him in those. And in fact, he makes a distinction, I think, between Anne, who does seem to be a mystic, and himself. The timeless moment and the reflection on it, that's, I think, as close as he comes. Yeah? Think about that, yeah. There were
one more in the
somebody
public
over here.
sphere, and then we will go into the private sphere, because I know that some need to go. But
I just wanted to say thank you for this incredible experience of finding that there was more to come, that something did happen that mellowed him and made him happier.
Yes.
You never know that.
Yes,
So
yes.
you can.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody at lunchtime, and mentioned, of course, Elsie dies in 91. They've been married for 50 years. They had this extraordinary relationship. The phrase is Goody on his own, the son. Both artistic. I think there's a profound love, which comes out in the poetry. I do hope he told her that he loved her. You know, it's their 80th birthday, but what comes out, of course, is the silence in the meantime. And I was talking to somebody earlier on, and I said, it's the silence where you don't have to talk. You've loved somebody for many years, and you don't have to. He was not a great talker, garrulous. It's not a word he liked. But then he did remarry. He married a Canadian lady called Betty Vernon, and a lady who was as unlike Elsie as she was. It'd be very hard to find. I never met Elsie, sadly. I did met, she's died now, Betty a few times. She was a smoker. She was a drinker, not in any kind of, medical sense. But I was telling the story, I apologise for this, over lunch. She got in touch and she said, got some books and some things here which I'd like to go to the centre. So Jason and I went down on Saturday afternoon. It's just Pentreveli, near Portmadog, where they had lived in his last days. And so we had tea, formal china and the whole bit. And then she gave us this rattan chair, which had been RS's, and this typewriter and some books and so forth. And so we're putting this into the car, so Betty comes out and says, "Will you boys like a drink?" Now I knew that Jason had to do that evening, he had to be at, and I was driving. So I was like, Jason said, well. So we went back in. And out comes a tray of this is gossip, of spirits. There was single malt whiskies, Lidfrock, I remember, and pink gin. I'd never seen pink gin. I had a sheltered upbringing. And so, as we learned, this was Betty. She was social. She was friendly. Byron Rogers, who wrote the biography, he was a journalist on Fleet Street, or had been, and he was in awe of Betty's capacities to drink an alternate. Sorry, I'm loading this. This is quite unfair. She gave him several years of happiness. I think the relationship, there's evidence that the relationship became less happy at the very end, but they travelled in a way that he hadn't travelled before. She said she liked to go to Hay, which he would, he went to these things reluctantly, but she liked to go to Hay, and so they went to Hay and had a good time, and I saw her there. So there is that other situation. I think she gave RS a sort of release. She allowed him to express modes of feeling which hadn't formed parts of the relationship with Elsie. That's as tactfully as I can put it. But when you see RS and Betty in the queue in what was then Asda's, I think, in Bangor buying a lottery ticket, you know that RS Thomas's life has changed.
Well,
sorry about the scuttlebutt.
Yes, and those enjoyed it at home as well. I know there are at least 4 who would like to ask questions. We will call a formal halt here, but do please then come and ask the questions as you wish. Quite like that final thought, that whoever we are loving or liking this day, let's make sure we actually say it.
Yes.
Yes, in whatever way. And part of what we need to say is a huge thank you to Tony for all the preparation, all the work, and delivering it so well and wonderfully to us all. We have a tiny something from OCSG for you, so may I give that to you? Raucous round of applause, please. Who, as ever, does all the hard work behind the scenes. So thank you to Ben. And on the 22nd of June, we have Shakespeare and Spirituality. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Yes. So everybody very welcome for that. Ben, any other notices I should be giving?
Just that we have next year building up a new programme, and it will include some talks by Mark Oakley, and also some talks by a Professor Campbell from York University, the biggest college, Brooklyn from York, on I was meant to say R S Thomas, but it isn't on R S Thomas. It's on William Butler Yeats, and maybe a bit of Seamus Heath as well.
Excellent.
Touching Irish on St Patrick's Day this time next year.
That sounds very good. So,
building into a new programme.
and on this little piece, this has the rest of what's happening this year. And as Ben said, Mark Oakley and the Professor from York on Yeats and others. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a wonderful Holy Week and Easter when that comes for us all. And this was a wonderful introduction. So thank you, Tony, very much. Thank you all so much.
No, it's not. I'm not asked. Well, you can't say I'll be in some role when we come. I'm having one of those fashions.